Hello and welcome everyone back to the Planning Perspectives podcast. I'm one of your two hosts for today, Jamie Hopkins, and I'm joined by my co-host, Kate Duffy. Kate, great to see you.
Good morning, Jamie. It's good to be here. Good to see you too.
Yeah, well, thanks for being on the show today. We're going to dive into a really fun topic all around education planning, which is probably one of the more complex puzzles for families. You know, when you look at the growing costs of college and actually growing costs in some areas of private schools for middle school, for high school, it's all over the place, graduate schools, and the costs seem to have just been going up without stop for years and years and years.
Yes. It is a topic that we get a lot of questions from clients on. We'll talk about different strategies today and some of the underlying emotions that come along with the decision to pay for college or not to pay.
Yeah, and it's a nuanced conversation, right? It's not always that we're just going to pay and fund everything, and functionally, everybody can't. It's why student loans exist. It's why different types of schools and opportunities and scholarships exist. It is going to be a nuanced question, and where should you go? And I think we'll probably tell some stories today, dive into some planning strategies, and go from there. But let's, I guess, hop into this a little bit and talk through some of this planning.
Yeah. So I'll just start off by saying, and we mentioned this, the cost of college. So in 25 and 26, this school year, just to put some numbers around this, the cost of a private institution, university, college is about $44,000 a year. A public out-of-state annual tuition is about $25,000, and a public in-state is about $11,000 a year for education. So the costs, like you said, they're climbing. It's an exorbitant amount for education, but if it's something that you value and something that you want to give your children or someone else in your life, you want to plan around that.
Yeah, and I think in-state tuition's been a very interesting conversation with different states, because you've seen some states where in-state students really struggle to even get in because they've shifted so much looking for out-of-state students to fund it. Been a very interesting development, and now there's been, at the state level, pushback against that on how almost impossible it is for in-state students to get into the universities. Other places have gone the opposite way, where they're really supportive of getting their in-state students into those universities. Florida's had some interesting things there with scholarships, but definitely a complex situation. I think we'll see throughout this. It very much depends on what state and what decisions you decide to make about funding, right? Like, how much do you want to fund? What do you think? Are they going to get scholarships? Are they even going to go to college or university? Right. And these are complex questions that when your kids are 3 and 4, you really can't answer yet, right? Like, you don't know what's going to be happening 15 years from today.
So, and that's really interesting that you say that, because we talk about the earlier that you plan for education, the better. But it is like when dollar number one goes away for college education, there's an expectation there. So underneath the sort of decision to make the financial commitment to education, you have emotions like fear, what if, you've got hope. There's a lot of love in it. We hear families of stories of sacrifice and effort. And so one of the things that I wanted to dive into before we get to some of the technical stuff is, what are the considerations of the parent, the grandparent, the caregiver when they're making these decisions? Because if it was just purely financial, it would be pretty easy. Do we have the means? Don't we have the means? And is this something that we want to do? And we've talked to clients, and even yourself, we've talked about funding education. So if you don't mind, would you tell us the story of how you funded the 529, which I know we've talked about before, but then some of the expectations that are around that, because your children are still young.
They are, yeah. Well, so I think a little bit of my background, though, is I've been a big fan of education. I have 13 different degrees and designations. So it's a lot. And I don't recommend that for most people. I work with a lot of universities in my nonprofit, about 52. And when students ask me this, I give them a kind of the opposite of what I did. Is I was like, go work somewhere, understand what you want to do, specialize in it. But for me, neither one of my parents graduated college. And I saw college, and then law school in particular, as being a structured pathway like into a career. Where when people talk about general business and like, you like go run a business, like, I didn't know how to get there. It seemed very, very foreign of like, how do you process this? How do you network? How do you find the right place into which you want to go down this journey? So instead, I saw education as a structured process to find your way into a career. So, Kate, that structure that I saw in my life, I felt like was important at least to provide that opportunity for my kids.
Mhm.
And so the story around mine, though, that was kind of the background, a little bit of a long story, but I was actually speaking at an event and I was out in Las Vegas and I just presented to actually thousands of financial advisors. It's actually the biggest event I've ever presented at. I think there were 4,000 financial advisors at this event. And, in Vegas, everybody after is going gambling and going out to shows and all these things. And I'm not a gambler. It doesn't make sense to me. I don't get a high from it. So I just don't do it. And I was talking about, planning for retirement, behavioral finance, and all these things on stage. And I got off. I was like, well, instead of going gambling, like, what can I do today that would be super meaningful? So that day, I went and funded for the very first time. I set up and funded for two of my kids. I hadn't had my third kid yet, but went and funded two of theirs. And I put money away in their 529 that night up in my Vegas hotel room. And it also just has become a really cool story because, like, how many people decide to set up their 529s
Right.
in Vegas after speaking to thousands of people? They're all going out gambling and drinking. And I'm like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go do some financial planning for my family. But it was really meaningful. And then I set eventually kind of a contribution goal for all three. And I'm not every year, right? Like, I kind of do like bunching in years when I feel like I can contribute, but it's not every year. But I had a contribution goal, but that might not be 100% of their college education costs. And I felt fine with that because I do think some ability to work in college or scholarships or even student loans or kind of self-funding as you go type of approach, I think it's okay to have that. And at least for me, I felt comfortable with an approach of contribution amounts, investing it for at least a decade plus, and then allowing for some flexibility there. And that's really been my approach to it.
And I think that a lot of people go through that. Like you talked about how you knew education was of value to you. So we think we make these decisions through the lens, our own experience of what's valuable to us. And then we make decisions. Like with our financial decisions, we transfer values and we teach lessons. And that's something that's really important. And also understanding like the engagement versus the entitlement. When you bring up maybe paying as you go or taking out student loans, there's a lot of lessons that can be transferred in this equation here. And it's also, when do you start to have the conversation with your kids? Because I was actually just talking to another advisor the other day, and he's like, I've funded my 529. And I think his daughter was 16 years old, and she was sort of inquiring about what was there. Because if we don't have these conversations and expectations aren't laid out there, she was sort of dreaming of what college could look like for her, where she could go. And it's, how do we start to have these conversations? Because it's not a one and done. It's not a good idea to just have the conversation once about this.
Yeah, so all of my kids are under 10, but they all know they have savings. They don't know what a 529 is yet, but they do know that there's money put aside for them. They don't know how much, but they know that I have done that. But they ask a lot. Like, they're always like, how much money do I have, Dad? And I'm like, you have nothing. And they're like, well, no, you put money away. And I was like, I did, but it's not yours yet. That's the conversation we have a lot. So it's kind of fun, and they're very interested in it. But it's just different because I live in this world I talk about all the time. My daughter's gone to a conference and watched me speak too, which I think is a great thing. If you travel for work and you take your kids to see you, I've done that. I would like to do it with all three. And I just have my new book out, Your Retirement Sketchbook, and my daughter read the introduction. She got the very first copy. I signed it for her, and she read the whole introduction, and I was super proud of her for reading it. She was like, that was really detailed, which I thought that was her takeaway from it. But since we talked about 529s, by far and away the most popular funding approach, and then student loans. They're really the two main ways that college is funded today. But Kate, why don't you walk us through a little bit, just some basics around 529s? Do you want to just cover a little bit of that? What you can fund, any types of thoughts there?
Sure. So let's talk about the benefits of a 529 plan. So one of the benefits is tax-free growth. So that is if you take the monies out for qualified education expenses. So the first thing is when you contribute money to a 529, all of those dollars are already taxed. So you're never going to pay tax on that again. When you invest it, all of the earnings and the growth within the account, again, are not taxed while they're in there and are tax free when they come out, which means more dollars are going towards education. So you get to bypass the federal and generally the state taxes on this. If we compare that to, let's just say, a taxable brokerage account that you just earmarked for education, you'd have to pay tax on the earnings along the way and then the growth when it comes out, which means money is going to Uncle Sam and education. So it's very beneficial from that perspective. If you take the money out for non-qualified expenses, you do have to pay taxes on the earnings and the growth, and you get hit with a 10% penalty. Now, generally, there's always exceptions. So there's a couple exceptions to the 10% penalty. One being if there's the death or disability of the beneficiary. And another being if you get a scholarship. If the beneficiary gets a scholarship, you can take that equivalent out of the 529 without the penalty. But again, you have to pay taxes. Uncle Sam's going to get his money. You have to pay taxes on the earnings and the growth.
Yeah.
So that's one of the benefits. And also, when you make those contributions, it's out of your estate, but you still have control of the account, which I think is something interesting and worth noting.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. The one misnomer I see a lot in this is people think that there's a federal tax deduction when you fund
Yes.
529. So that's usually part that we have to explain to people when we're talking about this. But we're filming in Pennsylvania today, but Pennsylvania does have a really nice tax benefit as it comes, or actually a couple. But do you want to hit on the main one for at least Pennsylvania? Then maybe a couple of the details of our surrounding neighboring states.
Yeah. So Pennsylvania has a state income tax deduction for what you contribute to the 529. And so I'll start with the annual exclusion. So the IRS says every year you can gift a certain amount of money to any individual. And so for 2026, that's $19,000. So that means any parent or anyone can contribute $19,000 without any gift in estate or without any gift tax to a 529. And then there's also this technique called front loading. So the IRS also says we will let you gift up to 5 years in 1 year without any gift tax ramifications. And so that means one parent or one person who is contributing to the 529 for one child can contribute up to $95,000 a year. In a two-parent household, that could be $190,000 in 1 year. Again, that escapes any gift taxes. So in the subsequent 5 years, if you wanted to make additional gifts, we'd have to look to the different exclusion of the lifetime exclusion, which is about $15 million. But that is a very big benefit in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, absolutely. And that might sound like a lot of listeners are like, I do not have $95,000 or $190,000 to donate to a 529 plan in any year. The situation from a planning perspective that I often see here is when somebody sells a business that they might have significant state income taxes in that year of sale. So one way to reduce that down is to actually bunch in that year. And if you have 3 kids, you're now talking almost, right, $600,000 that you could contribute to 3 kids in 1 year and not have be subject to the state income tax. And at 6%, we're talking about really serious money and savings here that is just not going away. And all of a sudden, your kids are now funded for college, like very, very quickly. And so if you have those big income tax years, I always look at that and charitable contribution bunching, very similar approach, as good strategies to make those big funding or gifts you might want to make, but reduce down the taxes. And it's really interesting because 529 plans are one of the few areas that to get that annual exclusion of $19,000 as a gift to somebody and not have it count against your lifetime exemption amount, it has to be what we call a present interest gift. It's kind of a little wrinkle, which means like you can't have too many restrictions on it. Like normally you can't say like, hey, I'm going to give this to you as long as you go to college in 20 years.
Right.
It doesn't qualify. But in this instance, the rules have allowed for it because really the kids cannot use it today. It really is a future interest gift that you could rename the beneficiaries and change it. but it still qualifies. So it's a value add from a planning and tax perspective as it relates to these rules around annual giving and
Hmm.
529 plans.
And I think you hit on a good point of the flexibility of it. So anybody can set up a 529, anybody can be the beneficiary, and there's no income limitations if you are going to set one up, which I think is pretty interesting. And you can transfer funds from one 529 to another 529 of a qualified relative of the beneficiary or change beneficiaries, like you said,
Yeah.
without any tax consequences. And I would say the IRS definition of a qualified beneficiary relative
Yeah.
is very broad. It's siblings, step siblings, half adopted, foster,
Hmm.
cousins, aunts, uncles. Like it is a very broad definition. So there's a lot of flexibility there, which is nice.
You can also move 529 plans between states. It's a little bit more complicated, but it
Hmm.
is doable. And there are times if you relocate, you should consider that. There are
Hmm.
benefits at the state level in Pennsylvania of having your 529 plan in the Pennsylvania 529 plan, whereas scholarships don't kind of count for certain things
Hmm.
if it's a state school and it's in your 529 here. But if you're using, say, a Maryland plan in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania is one of the unique states where you can get the state income tax deduction regardless of what
Right.
529 plan you use,
Yeah.
but you don't get this kind of special piece about not having the 529 plan count against the scholarships for in-state universities unless it's here in Pennsylvania. So it's a little nuanced, but the big picture is if you started a 529 plan and you lived in a different state
Hmm.
and you moved, you should look at, should I remove this 529 plan to my state? Because sometimes there are in-state benefits of using that plan. So it is just something to look at. If you've always lived here, you've always lived in New Jersey, or always lived in Delaware, don't have to worry
Hmm.
about it. But if you've moved around a couple times and you started somewhere else, it is a consideration to
Hmm.
look at.
So, what about 529s and how they impact financial aid?
Yeah, and that's a great question. The hard part with that is it really does depend on the state. So that is one of those portions that there are uh income-based scholarships at the state
Hmm.
level. And in some states, your 529 will count against that. They will
Hmm.
look at those as resources and assets. In other states, they will say Pennsylvania, if you're using a PA 529, will say in-state scholarships, right? We will not look at your 529 as an
Hmm.
includable asset for it. So it's kind of it depends answer,
Right.
but more often than not, that gets back to if you're using a state school with a 529 in that state, there are often benefits there for aid. But if you just have a 529 in Nebraska and you're going to Pennsylvania schools, they
Hmm.
will likely look at that as an asset that you have available for funding.
Okay. And let's talk about some of the distributions that you can make that are qualified from a 529. So, obviously, tuition and books, room and board up to a certain amount. It depends on what the college says the room and board cost would be. You've got professional
Mhm.
certifications that are covered now, and even exam fees. So, you can cover the bar exam or a CPA exam. You have the ability to pay for kindergarten through 12th grade up to $20,000 a year now per beneficiary. You can repay student loans, which is a really interesting, like if you think about it, when you think about the engagement of the student, if you wanted someone to have skin in the game, they could apply for student loans and use the 529 to pay it back. That could be one way to use it. There's also, I came across this the other day, which I thought was really interesting, that outward bound leadership and development programs can
Okay.
actually be covered
Yeah.
by $529. Um, Technology and software that is required by the university can be
Y-
covered as well. Are there any other things that I'm missing? There are a
Well,
multitude of.
yeah, the other interesting one that's occurred, which is kind of encompassed in what you said, is you can have a 529 and yourself as beneficiary too,
Yes.
which a lot of people don't think about. But if you were, if you're 30 years old and you say, look, I think in the next 10 years, I'm going to go back to school, you can actually fund it for yourself as
Hmm.
beneficiary, get all the same tax benefits, and then go back to graduate school. We have also seen a move. University towns have started to take this approach, is actually trying to draw in retirees and offering
Mhm.
retirement type classes for retirees. And they now have started to fund 529s to then go back to school in retirement. So it's a very interesting cycle here because there aren't age limitations on when you
Right.
go to school, and you can have yourself as beneficiary. And a lot of people don't know that. They think, oh, like this is for your kids or your
Mhm.
grandkids, but it can be for you or your spouse also.
Right, and that is a really good point. If there are leftover dollars in a 529, what do we do with them? You can turn it back to
Hmm.
yourself. You can also, for a beneficiary that has leftover funds, you can now fund a Roth IRA with those dollars. Now, there are a couple stipulations. The account, the 529, has to be open for 15 years. The contributions have to be in there for 5 years.
Hmm.
And the beneficiary has to have earned income. But if you do have leftover dollars up to what the IRS says on a given year you can transfer over, you can actually transfer from the 529 to a Roth IRA for that same beneficiary.
Yeah, that's a very interesting one that came around just a couple years ago. And there's been a lot of writing on it. And it's this like weird wrinkle of planning. And I
Mhm.
think advisors get and tax professionals get very excited because we got like, like this was clearly written by tax professionals in this one because it's like really nuanced to your point. We've got these year requirements, this cap. You have to have enough income, as you said, earned income in
Mhm.
that year to contribute up to that amount. It's still capped annually by the annual Roth contribution limits per year. But then, funny enough, they took off the income limits on Roth for this. So
Mm.
you could make $300 million dollars in one year and do this $7,000 rollover from your 529 to Roth. Very interesting. So it's a very nuanced thing. But part of the philosophy behind it, which you mentioned, was what happens with leftover
Mhm.
dollars. And they wanted to provide people with an option to move $529 to something for their own retirement benefit
Mm.
in case you overfunded these accounts. We don't want to get people to the point where they say, I don't want to use 529s. What if I overfund it? What if my
Mhm.
kids get scholarships? I'm going to get taxed, right? And so these nuanced rules came in to say, look, if you overfund these, they get taxed, or there's some leftover money. You can use it for yourself. You can
Mhm.
roll it over to yourself over time. But we also don't want people to abuse these and fund them up and then have
Right.
this other kind of backdoor contribution aspect to retirement savings.
And with all the flexibility of changing a beneficiary, these 529 plans could go on. And I would say the worst case scenario is you get hit with the 10% penalty and the taxes.
So let's go over to another thing. Let's talk about some other accounts that we could possibly use. Right? So this is not the only way to
Mhm.
fund it, but let's just talk about other funding options, Kate. What are some other strategies you see for funding college education out there today?
So there are other ways to pay for education. There are Coverdell education savings accounts, there are UTMAs and UGMA accounts. Some people use their general savings accounts, like if they have brokerage accounts already, they might earmark a part of that for education savings. We've seen clients use lines of credit, home equity lines to pull for education. There's also cash value life insurance where you can pull the cash value to pay for it, or if there's a provision for a tax free loan, you can use that as well.
Yeah, so it looks like there's a lot of options there. And interestingly enough, the UTMA accounts, we work at WISFIS and Bryn Mawr Trust, and at WISFIS you can set them up for minors. And so I went through this process, not really to be honest, to fund college. Like I already told you, I had this 529 approach, but I wanted them to have this experience of getting an account set up. So I took each one of them individually into the bank in Wayne, Pennsylvania, and walked in and had them sit there as we went through all the
Mhm.
paperwork and sign it and set it up. And so there's restrictions on when they kind of take control of the side of UGMAs and
Right.
UTMAs, and they vary a little bit by state to state. But you can kind of put money in for the future is the best way to put that with those types of accounts. But it was a great experience because like they got this experience of setting up an account when they were little, and they got a lollipop and a little piggy bank and put some money in, and I had them gather up all their like coins and dollars that are crumpled up at home from different gifts, and took all of that. I did put some more on top of it in the account, but I took a photo of them in there for all three, and it was just a really good like savings experience for all the kids. And I try to think about like when can we add that kind of fun element or
Right.
experiential element to all this. I think it can be a mistake when you totally exclude the rest of the family from this experience because you want them to have positive
Right.
experiences
Hmm.
with savings and money and just understand these tactics and that there's things going on to fund things and life costs money,
Right.
instead of just being like, wow, everything shows up.
Yeah.
And so I've been very purposeful on some of these, and you can set that up at your bank, and we offer it here too.
Hmm. And it's great because you get them thinking about future planning. If you want something in the future, you have to start early.
Yeah. Well, you just said start early. So when should, grandparents,
Hmm.
parents, individuals be thinking about when should we start saving for college education expenses?
So the earlier, the better, really, because when you have time on your side and you have the ability to let these resources grow, that's when you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. So if you haven't started already, now is always a good
Yeah.
time if you can afford it. But it really is, and things do change.
Yeah.
So college isn't the only path forward. So I would say the earlier you can start, the better. Give yourself the time. And if you haven't started, today is always a good time to start.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite quotes, right? There's never a wrong time to do the
Right.
right thing. And I think it's very interesting. Actually, funny enough, I did not do this, but you can actually start saving before you have kids, which is wild to me in 529s because you can list yourself as
Correct.
beneficiary and change it later on. But it's an interesting thing to build up, kind of, that long elongated tax deferred growth is the earlier you start, the better that compounding gets.
Mhm.
It's not really even just the start early to start early mentality. Is the earlier you start, the benefit of the 529 is you are getting that tax deferred and
Yes.
ultimately tax free growth. And the more time you have, time is on your side with investing in
Mhm.
that approach. Uh, so I think one of the
S
other things we want to talk about, right,
Yeah.
is we've talked about all funding, but
Yes. But do we?
yeah.
Like, there is this question of if we have the resources, do we pay for this? How did you make your decision, Jamie?
Well, as I said, I made my decision in the sense that I had a lot of student loans. Actually, I didn't talk about this part. When I graduated law school, I had $187,000 student loans. And I remember sitting in a basement in my friend's house, and I had one of those yellow pads,
Mhm.
and I was looking at all the interest and principal payments. And I just remember feeling like, how will I ever pay this off? Right? Like it felt so daunting, and I actually think is like that level of fear around that much money and taking out that many loans can be really limiting and scary for people.
Mhm.
I don't think it's bad to have some loans. I do not want 100% fund it, whether they work or get scholarships or don't go to school. These are all possibilities. So I actually don't view it as 100%. Like I kind of mentally did like, what do I think will be roughly 80%? But the ranges are so big. Inflation on this could be so big. There's it's really hard to estimate this 15 years ahead. When you get to
Mhm.
like 5 years ahead, 3 years ahead, it becomes a lot clearer on what might be
Right.
occurring. And then 2 years out, you're like, how am I going to pay for this? But I think for some people, maybe their kids don't go to college at all. Maybe they're going to get scholarships. Maybe you decide that I don't want to spend money on college education. We'll borrow in the future. I'd rather buy a secondary house. I'd rather pay down the debt of my own house. I would rather save more for retirement. You might just decide that this is low
Mhm.
priority in the list of the thousand other priorities financially you have in life of paying bills, getting by day to day, dealing with, growing grocery store costs. Like,
Right.
and you might say this is not something we're going to prioritize. And if we get there, there's loans, there's scholarships, there's other options we can look at. And that's a perfectly reasonable and okay decision to make. And for some people, it might just be, I want to put something away to help, but like we're not going to be able to afford this whole thing. But something is there. One, and I'll close with this kind of interesting thing I bring up a lot when I talk about college education, and this is more of a challenge for people. But the data shows that if you have a household with only girls as the daughters, they save less for college than for households with boys as kids. Regardless of the family, if it's only a mom, they still save more when they have
How
boy
about that?
sons. It is a very interesting data point out there. But I bring this up a lot and I challenge you, like, make sure that you're like, not letting some of those biases probably come in. It's not like a purposeful thing. It's not like people are sitting down saying, I have a daughter, I'm not going to save
Right.
as much for her. But it is still prevalent in the US data across the board. When you correct for income, ages, education, it is still out there today, which to me is wild. Again, if that's your decision, it's fine. But there are probably some things like that you could challenge yourself on. And then one last tip from me is I think if you really care about this and education is super important to you, have the conversations with your kids, stress the importance of it for you,
Yes.
but also name their college account funds as something that makes you happy. You've heard me talk about this at
Yes.
work before. It's like rename them instead of like 529 plan and then like the 4 numbers, like call it the Notre Dame Rebecca's Fund.
Right.
It ties you to it. It brings some emotional joy. So when you contribute to it, you can like envision what this might look like.
Right.
If you're here, probably more Penn State or Villanova or Temple, right? But think about those things. Like what would actually excite you to participate in this? And if you love a university, your alma mater, or something else, think about it like that. And I think it can help you relieve some of these other burdens and kind of putting this money away for an uncertain future.
You make a lot of really great points there, Jamie. There's so many things to be considered, and there's a lot underlying just this one decision. It's part of the broader planning process. Talk to your advisor, reach out to us if you want to talk about this. Thank you for your great points today.
Yeah, well, this was a fun conversation. I got to tell more
Good.
stories than when we interview other people. So I appreciate you indulging my storytelling
Thank
today,
you, Jamie.
Kate. But thank you, everyone, for joining in today on the Playing Perspectives podcast and listening to Kate and I talk about all different types of education strategies and plans. If this is your first episode, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. Stay safe and healthy, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Planning Perspectives podcast. Don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when new episodes are available. Visit our website at www.bmt.com or call us at 833-973-7633. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision. Investments, not a deposit, not FDIC insured, not insured by any federal government agency, not guaranteed by the bank, may go down in value.